January 1944. Eastern Front. Dawn. The ground is locked in frost. Snow lies thin and brittle over frozen soil, crushed flat by tracks that arrived hours earlier. In the distance, engines idle low, heavy, impatient. 200 German Panzers sit beyond the tree line, their steel silhouettes barely visible through drifting white haze. Closer to the front line, men crouch behind earthworks and timber braces. Their breath clouds the air. Fingers numb around steel handwheels and cold metal sights. Ahead of them stands a gun few outside this sector have ever seen in combat. A long barrel, narrow shield. Ammunition stacked carefully, counted twice. It was never meant to face this many tanks. It was never meant to stop a massed armored assault on its own. German doctrine says this position should already be collapsing. Reports from command assume breakthrough within hours. Armor concentrated like a hammer. Speed and numbers meant to decide everything, before resistance can even form. But the gun remains silent, waiting as the first panzers begin to move, their tracks grinding into the frozen earth. The question is no longer whether an attack is coming, but why this single weapon was placed here at all. Against odds that German command itself believed could not be overcome. By the winter of 1943-1944. The war on the Eastern Front had entered a phase of brutal momentum. The German army was no longer advancing with the confidence of earlier years, but it remained dangerous, especially where armor was concerned. Even after catastrophic losses at Stalingrad and Kursk, German panzer divisions still represented the most refined armored force in Europe. Their strength no longer lay in numbers alone, but in doctrine, concentration, speed, and the belief that massed armor could still rupture any defensive line if applied decisively. The Red Army, meanwhile, had learned through loss. In 1941 and 1942, Soviet anti-tank defenses had been scattered, underpowered, and often deployed too late. Light guns proved useless against newer German armor. Infantry anti-tank teams paid in blood for every disabled vehicle. Entire defensive sectors collapsed because the tools to stop armor simply did not exist in sufficient quantity or quality. That failure forced change. Not gradual change, but urgent, industrial, uncompromising adaptation. By late 1943, Soviet command faced a strategic reality. German armored thrusts were no longer aimed at sweeping advances deep into territory, but at localized counterattacks designed to stall offensives, restore defensive lines, or buy time for withdrawal. These panzer groupings were often dense. 200 tanks concentrated along narrow corridors, supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled guns. If such a force broke through, it could unravel weeks of operational progress in a matter of hours. Stopping that kind of assault required more than courage. It required range, penetration, reliability, and, above all, timing. Soviet artillery doctrine had traditionally emphasized massed fire rather than precision. Anti-tank defense relied on layers: mines, infantry teams, light guns, then heavier artillery firing over open sites. But this system strained under modern armor. German tanks were faster, better protected. Often engaging from distances, Soviet guns could not reach to close that gap. Soviet engineers revisited an idea first explored before the war: a high-velocity anti-tank gun capable of defeating armor at long range, not with weight of shell, but with speed. The concept was sound. The execution was difficult. Production issues delayed deployment. Barrel wear was extreme. Ammunition quality had to be exact. Training crews to exploit its advantages took time. And early in the war, the weapon had been deemed impractical. Too complex. Too fragile for frontline chaos. But by 1943, the battlefield no longer allowed such hesitation. As German armor grew heavier and engagements stretched farther across open terrain, the need for a gun that could strike first and kill at distance became unavoidable. Limited numbers were quietly reintroduced, not paraded, not publicized. Assigned to sectors where failure was not an option. By January 1944, One such sector lay directly in the path of a German armored counterstroke. Reconnaissance reports confirmed what commanders feared: a panzer force assembling beyond the tree line, preparing to drive straight through a thinly held defensive belt. Conventional weapons would slow them. Mines would thin them. But neither would stop them. So the order was given to deploy a gun that few had seen fire in anger, placed not behind layers of defense, but at the very point where German armor would expect resistance to collapse first. And with that decision, the battlefield shifted from inevitability to uncertainty. The gun crews knew what was coming. German command believed they already knew the outcome. The distance between those assumptions would be measured meters and minutes. The weapon positioned along that frozen sector of the front was not new in concept, but it was rare in execution. Designated the 57mm ZiS-2 anti-tank gun. It had first appeared in 1941, at a time when German armor was still relatively light. On paper, it was extraordinary. Its long barrel generated muzzle velocities exceeding 1,000 meters per second, far higher than most contemporary anti-tank guns. At range, its armor-piercing rounds could punch cleanly through German tanks before crews even realized they were under effective fire. But brilliance on paper did not guarantee survival in war. Early production exposed serious problems. The barrels wore out too quickly. Ammunition manufacturing tolerances were unforgiving. At a time when Soviet factories were struggling simply to survive evacuation and bombardment, the ZiS-2 was labeled inefficient, over-engineered, wasteful. Production halted in favor of simpler, heavier guns that could be built faster and endure harsher handling for nearly 2 years. The ZiS-2 faded from frontline relevance. And German armor changed. By 1943. Panzer IVs carried thicker frontal armor. Panthers and Tigers appeared in increasing numbers. Engagement distances expanded. The older Soviet 45mm and even many 76mm guns struggled, unless fired from dangerously close range. Crews paid with their lives for every hit. Suddenly, the ZiS-2's speed mattered again. Production quietly resumed in mid-1943. With improved metallurgy and more reliable ammunition. But numbers remained limited. The gun was not issued broadly. Instead, it was assigned selectively to anti-tank strongpoints, to threatened sectors, to moments where German armor was expected to concentrate rather than disperse. This secrecy was not about deception. It was about scarcity. German intelligence was aware of Soviet anti-tank improvements, but reports consistently underestimated their deployment density. German command still believed that armored mass could overwhelm defensive belts before specialized weapons could be brought to bear. Their confidence was rooted in experience. Time and again, speed and concentration had cracked defenses that appeared solid on maps. From the German perspective, 200 Panzers assembled for a counterattack represented overwhelming force, supported by self-propelled guns, engineers, and infantry. The formation was designed to punch through, exploit gaps, and force the Soviets to abandon exposed salients. Operational reports from German staff officers reflected this assumption. Resistance was expected. Losses were anticipated. But decisive failure was not. The Soviets, however, were no longer defending blindly. Reconnaissance aircraft tracked the armored buildup. Forward observers marked likely approach routes. Terrain was studied not for retreat, but for engagement. Frozen ground restricted maneuver. Snow narrowed avenues of advance. Fields that favored speed and summer now funneled armor into predictable corridors. That was where the ZiS-2 was placed. Not behind the front line. Not as a reserve. But as a gatekeeper, crews assigned to the gun were chosen carefully. Experienced gunners, calm loaders, men who understood that their advantage lay not in rapid fire, but in precision. Each shell would matter. Each shot would reveal their position. Orders were explicit. Hold fire. Allow the armor to close. Engage at ranges where penetration was certain. But return fire would be delayed. It was a dangerous calculation. German command believed no. Single anti-tank position could withstand a concentrated armored assault. Doctrine said suppression would silence resistance. Numbers would absorb losses. Momentum would carry the day. The Soviet plan accepted none of those assumptions. As dawn lifted and the engines beyond the tree line began to rise in pitch, the ZiS-2 crews adjusted their sights and waited not for the first tank, but for the moment when belief met reality. That moment was approaching fast. The men assigned to the ZiS-2 did not speak much as morning advanced. Words had already been used where they mattered, during briefings, range estimations, and rehearsals conducted in the dark. Now, there was nothing left to explain. Each man understood his role with mechanical clarity. The gunner stayed fixed to the sight, scanning for the first shape to break from the tree line. The loader handled shells with deliberate care, fingers numb but precise. The commander watched the ground, not the tanks measuring distance by landmarks burned into memory. They were not elite by reputation. There were no decorations pinned to their coats that morning. What set them apart was familiarity with failure. Most had seen defenses collapse before. Most had watched lighter guns fail against armor that refused to stop. That memory sharpened their focus. Fear was present, but controlled. Not the panic of surprise, but the tension of waiting. They knew that once firing began, the gun's position would become a target within minutes. Survival depended on discipline. No wasted shots. No premature fire. They waited because waiting was the only way to live long enough to matter. German armor advanced, according to doctrine. Columns tightening as they approached the engagement zone. Tanks did not fan out immediately. Speed and cohesion came first. Breakthrough would follow. That choice shaped the battlefield. The ZiS-2's advantage lay in range and penetration, but only if the engagement unfolded along predictable lines. Soviet planners had chosen ground that denied lateral movement. Frozen ditches, tree lines, and snow-choked depressions forced the Panzers into narrow approaches. Distance was measured not in meters alone, but in seconds. At 1,000 meters, German tanks were confident. At 800, still aggressive. At 600, guns elevated. Optics searching. The ZiS-2 waited beyond all three. When the first tank crossed into the designated engagement range, it was already too late to maneuver. The geometry was set. Steel would meet velocity before doctrine could adapt. The ZiS-2 did not rely on brute force. Its shells were lighter than those fired by heavier guns. What made them lethal was speed. At high velocity, armor behaved differently. Plates fractured instead of deforming. Spalling turned confined spaces into killing chambers. A penetration did not need to be large, it only needed to be fast. German crews had learned to survive hits from older guns. They trusted their armor. They trusted distance. They trusted experience. What they had not yet faced was a weapon that erased the margin they depended on. The ZiS-2 did not roar. It cracked. A sharp, violent sound that arrived almost simultaneously with impact. For the first tank hit, there was no warning, no incoming whistle. No time to react. The assumption that safety increased with distance was about to be shattered. And as the leading elements of the Panzer forced cross into open ground, all three angles, human discipline, tactical geometry, and technological surprise began to converge. The moment of contact was no longer a question of if, but exactly when. From the German staff's forward observation posts, the situation appeared favorable. Reports confirmed the armor concentration, roughly 200 Panzers, supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled artillery, moving steadily through the snow-laden corridor. Command confidence remained high. Doctrine dictated that massed armor could absorb casualties and maintain momentum. Resistance would be suppressed quickly by concentrated fire and coordinated maneuvers. In previous engagements, even scattered anti-tank fire had been manageable. This sector, however, had a single untested gun. Its presence was noted in reconnaissance, but it was dismissed as inconsequential, an isolated obstacle. Unlikely to impede an entire armored division. German officers communicated with precision, issuing orders for maintaining speed and cohesion. Keep formation tight. Keep advancing. No delays, one operational note emphasized. Even the prospect of mines or light artillery was considered manageable. No scenario anticipated a weapon capable of neutralizing tanks. Before they reached effective firing range, confidence was a shield. But that shield would soon be tested against reality. For the Soviet crews, the psychological burden was immense. The gun's rarity, combined with the scale of the approaching threat, meant failure would be catastrophic. Every shell fired carried not just mechanical consequences, but emotional weight, the survival of men in adjacent trenches, the fate of retreating infantry, the integrity of the line itself. German crews, by contrast, entered the engagement with overconfidence. Years of victories and doctrine reinforced the belief that speed and armor alone determined outcomes. Losses were expected but controllable. The idea that a single weapon could inflict decisive damage seemed almost impossible. This disparity of expectation would shape reactions on both sides. Once the first shell struck, the psychological calculus shifted instantly. Surprise and disbelief rippled through German formations. For Soviet crews, adrenaline and fear sharpened every movement. Precision became instinct. Every action mattered. Morale, long considered secondary to firepower, now played a decisive role. It would amplify the weapon's effect far beyond its physical capability, turning anticipation into hesitation and doubt, an invisible multiplier on the battlefield. Beyond strategy and firepower, there was a moral dimension to the deployment. Commanders on both sides faced difficult decisions. For the Soviets, placing a limited, valuable gun in the path of overwhelming armor meant consciously risking the lives of the crew. For the potential of high strategic impact, every calculated risk in war carries moral weight. But here, the consequences were stark. For German commanders, doctrine emphasized relentless advance. Retreat or caution was punished by operational failure. But so too is the unexpected when even a single hidden weapon could disrupt entire plans. War is a realm of impossible choices. Here, both sides confronted them in real time. Human courage intertwined with the cold arithmetic of strategy as the Panzers approached the engagement zone. These angles, the human, tactical, technological, command, psychological, and moral converged. Each perspective foreshadowed the coming clash, setting the stage for a moment that would defy expectation. The engines beyond the tree line droned steadily. Soon the silence would end. It was 9:47 hours. January sunlight glinted off steel, reflecting through frost and snow. The tree line beyond the forward Soviet position began to move. Tracks crushed the brittle snow in long, resonant rumbles. 200 German Panzers advanced in disciplined columns, their commanders confident, their gunners scanning for targets as doctrine demanded. The ZiS-2 crew remained motionless behind their shield, eyes locked on the first silhouette emerging into the open, breath held. The gunner adjusted his sights to 800 meters, a range where the gun's velocity ensured a near-certain hit. This was farther than most Soviet guns could engage. Farther than German crews expected anyone could strike effectively. The first tank crossed the line. A Panther, gleaming steel, turret scanning left and right, oblivious to the threat. The gun fired. A single shell, invisible until impact, struck the Panther's frontal armor. There was no dramatic explosion, no fireball, just a violent fracture, spalling the interior and killing the gunner inside. The tank shuddered and skidded to a halt. Others hesitated, following doctrine that assumed suppression would come later, not from a single, unseen gun. The second shot followed almost immediately. Another tank, another kill. The line wavered. Commanders yelled corrections, but the formation had already been disrupted. Tanks slowed, hatches popped open, men peering anxiously from within. On the Soviet side, adrenaline sharpened every movement. Loaders worked with mechanical precision. Commanders calculated the next angle, the next range. They understood the effect of each shell, not just physically, but psychologically. German command observers recorded the unexpected losses. Reports reached divisional headquarters. Unexpected anti-tank fire from concealed position. Losses higher than anticipated. Forward movement delayed. Confidence wavered. 200 Panzers, designed to crush any resistance, were now tentative snow churned beneath advancing tracks. Guns reoriented, engines idled, and panic began to spread through the lid elements. The engagement had begun not as predicted, but on terms dictated by a weapon German planners had dismissed as inconsequential. Every angle converged. Human skill, technological advantage, tactical foresight, psychological pressure. The battlefield had shifted in seconds, and yet this was only the beginning. By 10:05 hours, the rhythm of the battle had transformed. German formations that had been confident, precise, and relentless now staggered under an invisible threat. Tanks that had expected to steam across open ground without serious resistance now hesitated. Engines growling in anxious bursts, tracks skidding in the frozen soil. They ceased to cruise. Work with mechanical consistency. Each shell found gaps, weak points, or simply delivered kinetic devastation. Panthers and Panzer AVs, once the symbols of armored invincibility, fell in slow-motion collapses across the snowy field. Self-propelled guns attempted to suppress the hidden battery, but the narrow defile limited their fields of fire, and each gunshot was measured, deliberate, precise, never frantic. From the German command posts, disbelief replaced confidence. Field reports that had initially read like routine. Updates now carried an edge of alarm, engaged by unexpected high-velocity fire. Losses significant. Advance stalled. Formation cohesion breaking? Officers scrambled to issue corrections, but the assumptions underlying every doctrinal maneuver were collapsing. Speed could no longer dominate. Numbers could no longer guarantee breakthrough. The invisible force behind the firing line had shifted the balance. As the minutes passed, psychological pressure mounted. German crews, trained to trust armor and momentum, now hesitated. Hesitation compounded error. Tanks that should have flanked the position instead slowed, crowded together, making them easier targets. The morale advantage swung sharply toward the defenders. By 10:30 hours. The Germans faced a stark reality. 200 tanks, supposed to sweep through the sector with unstoppable force, had been reduced to scattered, cautious movements. Losses had mounted beyond initial projections. Commanders began diverting units to secondary objectives, abandoning the primary breakthrough plan. What had been expected as a swift, decisive assault had become a slow, grinding engagement against a single, strategically placed weapon, the ZiS-2 crews. Trained, disciplined, and focused, maintained their calm. Each round fired was a demonstration of precision over numbers, discipline over doctrine, and preparation over arrogance. Where German command had assumed impossibility, reality was proving otherwise. By mid-morning, silence punctuated the chaos. Tanks were immobilized. Engines idled uncertainly. Infantry hesitated behind armor that had always promised dominance. The battlefield itself seemed to recoil from the unexpected effectiveness of a single gun, its crews, and their meticulous preparation. The assumptions that had guided German armored doctrine, the infallibility of mass, the supremacy of speed, the predictability of resistance lay shattered on the snow. A new reality had emerged, that even the most disciplined formations could falter when faced with unforeseen precision, tactical foresight, and human determination. The front would never look at concentrated armor the same way again. By late afternoon, the battlefield was quiet, but the consequences of the morning's engagement were unmistakable. Reports from the German side counted dozens of tanks destroyed or immobilized. Panthers, Panzer AVs, and even a few Stooges lay scattered across the frozen ground. Some burnt out, others abandoned as crews retreated in haste. Infantry units, slowed by snow and confusion, were forced to dig in or withdraw to avoid becoming easy targets. The Soviet defenders, meanwhile, emerged with their positions largely intact. The ZiS-2 gun, though exposed and battered by the occasional return fire, had survived the engagement. Its crew, exhausted but alert, counted rounds and verified casualties. Every shot had counted. Every calculation had mattered. Command post communications painted a vivid contrast in expectation versus outcome. German officers admitted in reports that the sector had been stubbornly held by a single, unexpected weapon, noting that losses exceeded what doctrine had predicted for such a force. Soviet reports, conversely, praised the efficiency of placement, discipline of the crew, and the psychological impact on the enemy. Strategically, the engagement had immediate effects. German momentum stalled. Plans for rapid counterattacks were revised. Units that had expected a breakthrough found themselves forced to regroup and reassign priorities. In operational terms, a concentrated armored advance had been halted by a single well-positioned gun, a result almost unprecedented in contemporary doctrine. The psychological shock resonated beyond the immediate battlefield. German crews and commanders now regarded concentrated Soviet positions with renewed caution. Morale among attacking units suffered. Hesitation and doubt spread as survivors relayed the story of tanks falling to a weapon previously considered inconsequential. For the Soviet side, the encounter became a blueprint for localized anti-tank defense. Precision, discipline, and understanding of terrain had proven more decisive than raw numbers. Even with limited resources, a single weapon, employed with foresight and skill, could alter the balance of battle. This immediate outcome set the stage for broader strategic reconsiderations. Commanders on both sides were forced to rethink the reliability of assumptions, the role of technology in modern warfare, and the human factors that could tilt a conflict in an instant. The battlefield was silent now. But the lesson had already been written in snow and steel. The consequences of that single engagement extended far beyond the frozen clearing where tanks lay broken. For German command, the event forced a re-evaluation of armored doctrine. Concentrated tank assaults, once considered nearly invincible, now faced the very real possibility that a carefully prepared defensive position could halt even 200 vehicles. Operational reports highlighted the vulnerability of dense formations to precise, high-velocity fire, leading to revised tactics, more dispersed advances, increased reconnaissance, and greater emphasis on infantry screening for hidden weapons. Production priorities were also affected. German engineers accelerated development of reactive armor and improved communication between tank crews and support units, attempting to mitigate the threat of long-range, high-velocity guns. On the Soviet side, the success of the ZiS-2 in this engagement justified continued investment in high-velocity anti-tank weapons, even as other artillery programs competed for limited resources. Units across multiple fronts began integrating similar weapons in small, mobile, yet decisive positions, replicating the tactical model that had so effectively neutralized overwhelming numbers. Training doctrine shifted as well. Crews were instructed to value precision over volume, patience over reflex, and terrain exploitation over brute force. Commanders emphasized the psychological dimension of battle. An unexpected weapon could destabilize even the most disciplined formation. Manuals and post-battle reports from both sides noted the amplification of psychological impact, showing that a single strategically placed gun could produce effects disproportionate to its size. Historians would later view this engagement as a turning point, not for the war itself, but for armored warfare theory. It demonstrated the limits of massed armor against precision, patience, and tactical ingenuity. The encounter also highlighted the human factor. Disciplined crews, well-trained and mentally prepared, could multiply the effectiveness of scarce technology far beyond expectations. By the end of January 1944. The frozen field was empty of men and machines, but its lessons endured. German commanders approached future advances with caution. Soviet planners understood that ingenuity and foresight could, in select circumstances, overcome sheer numbers. The war continued, brutal and unrelenting. But the narrative of inevitability, the idea that massed armor would always prevail, had been challenged, reshaped, and in this sector, decisively proven false in the quiet that followed. The battlefield seemed almost suspended in time. Snow drifted over abandoned tanks, and the scorched earth bore silent testimony to the clash of steel and strategy. One weapon, meticulously placed and expertly crewed, had rewritten the assumptions of armored warfare. It was a reminder that in war, numbers alone do not guarantee victory. Discipline, preparation, and understanding of terrain can outweigh mass. Even when faced with overwhelming force, the ZiS-2 gun, often overlooked in the annals of history, became a symbol of precision triumphing over doctrine, of human skill magnifying the impact of technology. For those who fought that day, the encounter was more than mechanical success. It was validation that training, patience, and courage could confront what seemed impossible. For German commanders, it was a lesson in humility. Even the most advanced formations were vulnerable to unpredictability. This moment illustrated the broader truth of warfare. Victory is never guaranteed. It is earned sometimes by the few against the many. It challenges assumptions, reshapes strategies, and leaves echoes that influence doctrine for years to come. The frozen field where 200 tanks faltered and one gun held its ground remains a testament to that truth. A story of how ingenuity, preparation, and human determination can turn the tide against overwhelming odds. History remembers the numbers. It remembers the weapons. But it is moments like these where expectation collides with reality that remind us that war is as much about the human element as it is about steel and fire.